They told us the truth was recorded, but what if the truth was edited? Thumbs of black voices once whispered through cracked lips and trembling hands, desperate to leave behind something real. Memories of chains, screams, and prayers, etched into words before time erased them. But when those words reached the world, something had changed. Someone had decided which ones we were allowed to hear. The pages still exist, faded, yellow, and soft with age. But between the lines, entire lives are missing. Lines scratched out, stories silenced. It wasn't an accident, it was a choice. This isn't just history, it's a crime of silence, a story of stolen voices. The sound of pages flipping fades into a soft, rhythmic heartbeat. Then, the faint tap of a typewriter key echoes like a clock counting down truth's last moments. What did they erase, and why? The story begins in the 1930s. America is in the depths of the Great Depression. The government launches a massive project, the Federal Writers Project, to give jobs to writers and preserve the last memories of those who lived through slavery. They called it history, but what it became was censorship wrapped in civility. Across the South, in small towns and dusty porches, government workers sat with men and women in their 80s and 90s, black survivors of a world built on chains. Some still bore the scars of the whip. Others had voices so soft it felt like they were whispering from beyond the grave. More than 2,300 interviews, over 500 photos, thousands of stories captured on paper. But not all survived unaltered. Not all were allowed to tell the truth. The pens were not all neutral historians. Many were white Southerners, descendants of the same families who once owned the very people they now interviewed. Some still called them uncle or auntie. And in those quiet rooms, under polite smiles, the balance of fear never truly changed. A lifetime to be heard, but when they finally spoke, their words trembled with the same danger that once ruled their lives. Their truths were filtered through fear, shaped by the presence of white interviewers, contradicted the myth of happy slaves. And so the archives grew thicker while the truth grew thinner. Imagine it, centuries of pain distilled into polite conversation. A man describing his mother being sold, but his tears described as nostalgic. A woman recalling the master's hands in the night, her words turned into fond recollections. History rewritten into comfort, suffering translated into folklore. The slavery had evolved. It no longer needed chains or overseers. It had pens, editors, and official stamps. What happens when history itself becomes a new form of control? Because behind every redacted line, every missing page, every softened adjective, there was a scream that never made it to print. They said these narratives were meant to preserve history, but what they really preserved was control, because what they erased was the filth of truth, the parts too disturbing, too shameful, too revealing for a nation desperate to look innocent. Entirety passages vanished. Descriptions of the lash, of backs split open by wire whips, cut out. Testimonies of women violated by their masters and mistresses, erased to protect white family names that still carried weight in politics and wealth. The raw memories of children torn from their mothers, of bodies sold like cattle and buried without names, were deemed too emotional. Too emotional, as if pain itself had to be censored. In the official archives, the tone became strangely soft. Words like beat became punished. Rape became taken advantage of. Slave owner became planter. The violence was cleaned, the guilt washed away, the crimes rewritten in gentle ink. Slamming the stories of rebellion, the secret fire set in barns, the poisoned wells, the whispered prayers of revenge. The history books couldn't risk telling the world that enslaved people didn't just endure. They fought, resisted, and plotted freedom in the shadows. Crimson Save's myth had to survive. Even myth had to survive, even if it meant burying the truth. Even that shining symbol of moral salvation was weaponized. The original narratives included voices of those who remembered the Bible used as a chain. Obey your master, they were told, even as stories referenced in field notes but absent from official reports. Somewhere, fragments of the forbidden truth had survived. In a forgotten box, a letter surfaced, written by a white interviewer who admitted he was told to remove certain graphic or inflammatory material. Another researcher discovered private notes scrawled in pencil describing unsuitable content that had been excluded. Hidden collections began to surface, unedited transcripts, handwritten pages, stories that were never supposed to see the light of day. In those forbidden pages were horrors, a man describing being forced to breed with women he'd never met, a woman recounting how her baby was taken to be loaned to another master, a child remembering her mother's screams as the master's wife watched, not in pity but in satisfaction. And there were words of vengeance too. A few former slaves had spoken of joy at hearing their masters were killed during the war. They had laughed, cried, prayed for justice. Those pages never made it to print. Too bitter, they said. Too human. The curse of dialect added another layer of deception. Many of the narratives were deliberately written in exaggerated Negro speech, turning articulate survivors into caricatures. The goal was pity, not respect, entertainment, not empathy. These were not just stories, they were warnings, testimonies meant to remind the future of what happens when humanity is sold for power. But America chose to ignore them. For many survivors, freedom came without a voice. Their stories were freed only to be imprisoned again, not by chains this time, but by silence and distortion. Imagine spending a lifetime carrying pain you're not allowed to speak, then realizing the world only wants your story if it makes them comfortable. That was the second enslavement, the slavery of truth. Those who spoke were often re-traumatized. The interviews forced them to relive the screams, the hunger, the loneliness. But the worst wound came afterward, when they saw their words rewritten, stripped of meaning, transformed into something unrecognizable. They had trusted that someone would finally listen. Instead, their pain became a performance. Someone even whispered afterward that they should. Their ancestry found edited transcripts, redacted paragraphs, blank pages where a voice should have been. For many, one historian would later write, the archives were not a window into the past, but a mirror reflecting who America wanted to be. But there were always those who refused to let the silence win. The truth never dies. It only waits for someone brave enough to find it. By the 1960s, the ghosts of the erased began whispering again. During the civil rights movement, when the world's eyes turned toward America's unfinished reckoning, a new generation of Black historians began asking dangerous questions. They returned to the archives, to those fragile papers typed on aging government stationery, and what they discovered shattered the myth of the faithful slave. Hidden in storage boxes, tucked behind typed transcripts, they found the missing pages, handwritten notes from interviewers who'd ignored orders, raw descriptions of horror and defiance that had been cut from the official record. There were accounts of beatings so cruel they read like scenes from nightmares. One man remembered being tied to a tree and whipped until he saw stars in daylight. Another woman recalled her master forcing her to nurse his white child while her own went hungry. A man described how he prayed for lightning to strike the house of the master who'd sold his wife. These weren't the polite stories printed in government reports. These were the voices that white America had tried to bury. Historians like John Blassingame, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and others took those fragments and reassembled them piece by piece. They proved that the slave narratives weren't passive memoirs of obedience. They were survival literature, coded with anger, resilience, and quiet rebellion. In one rediscovered testimony, an elderly man confessed that he'd hidden a knife under his straw mattress every night for 20 years, waiting for a chance to strike his overseer. Another told of burning the master's corn crib in revenge for a friend's death. Those passages were deemed too inflammatory and deleted in 1937. Now they roared back like thunder. And the most haunting of all were the women's voices, unfiltered and raw. One mother described her master's wife ordering her flogged after discovering she had been forced into the master's bed. The interviewer, modern technology gave these lost voices new life. Digitization projects scanned and released thousands of original pages, many marked with edits and redactions. The public could now see the violence of censorship itself, lines crossed out, words replaced, emotions reduced. And yet, even with proof laid bare, denial persisted. Some white historians argued that reintroducing the unedited material would distort the historical tone. School boards claimed the full content was too disturbing for students. The same excuse used to erase the truth in the 1930s echoed again in the 21st century. Meanwhiles, and TV shows continued romanticizing slavery, turning plantations into picturesque backdrops, dressing horror in lace and candlelight. Even as the real voices screamed from the archives, popular culture whispered comfort to the descendants of the oppressors. Deadliest every edited word, every omitted sentence, was another lash from history's whip. But the reaction within Black communities was different, an awakening, a deep recognition. Reading the unedited testimonies felt like hearing ancestors breathe again, their rage and endurance vibrating through every syllable. Churches held readings. Schools hosted remembrance projects. Artists used the raw texts in poetry and film, letting the truth speak in ways no textbook ever had. The exposure ignited a new question. Why? Why had these stories been silenced for so long? The answers were as disturbing as the erasures themselves. It wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about power. A nation that called itself the Land of Liberty couldn't afford to let the world see that its foundations were built on blood and lies. To admit the full horror of slavery was to admit that freedom had never been free. It had been stolen, denied, and rewritten. Editors and officials in the 1930s feared that unfiltered truth would stir anger, disrupt peace, and expose the hypocrisy still rotting at the core of American identity. White fragility demanded silence, not for protection, but for preservation. And behind the bureaucracy, the descendants of slave-owning families still held influence. They donated to museums, funded historical societies, and whispered in politicians' ears. They didn't want their grandparents continued its control beyond emancipation, beyond death, into the very act of remembering. Today, when you read those unedited testimonies, you can feel the pulse of resistance between every line. The dialect that once mocked literacy now reads like poetry. Rhythm, pain, and defiance woven together. The metaphors once dismissed as superstition reveal coded messages of survival and rebellion. Becomes clear that the enslaved didn't just endure, they documented. They fought for truth even when speaking could cost them everything. We're supposed to preserve memory, but they became monuments to censorship, a reminder that history itself can be a weapon. The buried pages are rising from the dust. Their words no longer tremble, they thunder. Their voices, redacted for a century, now echo through classrooms, archives, and screens. Because history doesn't belong to those who wrote it. It belongs to those who lived it. And for every page they erased, 1,000 truths now return, spoken, sung, and remembered. These were the voices they tried to silence. But silence has limits. Truth doesn't die. It waits. And now it's speaking again, louder, angrier, unstoppable. The ghosts of the arrays will not rest until every stolen word is restored. The final image, black ink bleeding across paper, red lines fading, the voices once buried, now burning through the silence. The truth was never lost, only hidden. And no matter how much they tried to rewrite history, the voices of the enslaved have found their way home.